The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah, as Marine Lance Corporal Sarah Martinez checked her gear one final time. The city had become a maze of danger, where every corner could hide an insurgent and every doorway might conceal an explosive device. Sarah had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months, but nothing could have prepared her for what lay ahead on this particular day in November 2004. Sarah was part of a convoy tasked with delivering medical supplies to a forward operating base on the outskirts of the city. The mission seemed routine, but in Fallujah, routine missions had a way of turning deadly without warning. She sat in the passenger seat of the second Humvee, her M16 rifle resting across her lap as she scanned the empty streets through bulletproof glass. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying 12 Marines and a Navy corpsman. Their route took them through what intelligence reports called a moderately contested area. Military speak for a place where insurgents might attack, but probably wouldn't. Sarah had learned not to trust those assessments. The enemy had a way of appearing where they were least expected. As they rolled through a narrow street lined with abandoned shops, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The usual sounds of the city, children playing, vendors calling out, the distant hum of generators, were completely absent. The silence felt unnatural, threatening. She keyed her radio to alert the convoy commander. But before she could speak, the world exploded around her. The first improvised explosive device detonated directly beneath her Humvee, lifting the 7-ton vehicle off the ground and slamming it back down with crushing force. Sarah felt herself thrown against the roof, then slammed back into her seat as shrapnel tore through the armored plating like it was made of paper. The driver beside her slumped forward, blood streaming down his face from a gash across his forehead. Before Sarah could fully process what had happened, the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles filled the air. Muzzle flashes appeared in windows and doorways as insurgents opened fire from concealed positions. The ambush had been perfectly planned, turning their route into a killing zone with no easy escape. Sarah forced herself to move despite the ringing in her ears and the sharp pain in her left shoulder. She kicked open her door and rolled out onto the street, immediately taking cover behind the damaged Humvee. Bullets pinged off the armored hull as she tried to assess the situation. 2 of the other vehicles had also been hit by roadside bombs, and she could see Marines taking defensive positions wherever they could find cover. The firefight that followed lasted nearly 3 hours. Sarah and her fellow Marines found themselves surrounded, with insurgents firing from multiple directions. Every time they tried to advance toward better cover or reach their wounded comrades, they were driven back by intense gunfire. Sarah felt the first bullet graze her right arm, tearing through her uniform sleeve and leaving a burning sensation across her bicep. She pressed herself against a concrete barrier, trying to make herself as small a target as possible while returning fire. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Their radio operator had been wounded in the initial blast, cutting off communication with headquarters. Without air support or reinforcements, they were trapped in an increasingly desperate fight for survival. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's ammunition began to run low. She had started the mission with 7 loaded magazines, but continuous fighting had reduced her supply to just 2. Around her, other Marines were facing the same problem. The insurgents seemed to have an unlimited supply of fighters and weapons, replacing casualties almost as quickly as they fell. The second bullet hit Sarah in the left leg, just above her knee. The impact spun her around and sent her crashing to the ground behind a pile of rubble. Pain shot through her entire body as she tried to crawl to better cover. Blood was soaking through her pants, but she forced herself to keep moving. Stopping meant dying, and Sarah was not ready to die. From her new position, she could see that the situation had become even worse. 3 Marines were down, including their sergeant. The corpsman was doing his best to treat the wounded while under fire, but medical supplies were running low. Sarah watched helplessly as another Marine took a round to the chest and collapsed behind an overturned car. The third bullet caught her in the right shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her against a wall. The impact drove the air from her lungs and left her gasping for breath. Her right arm went numb, making it almost impossible to hold her rifle steady. She switched to firing left-handed, something she had practiced but never hoped to need in combat. As darkness began to fall, the insurgents pressed their attack. Sarah could hear them moving closer, their voices calling out in Arabic as they coordinated their assault. She knew they were planning a final push to overrun the Marines' positions. With her limited ammunition and growing number of wounds, Sarah wasn't sure how much longer she could hold out. The fourth bullet hit her in the abdomen, doubling her over in agony. She felt warmth spreading across her stomach as blood began to soak through her body armor. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but she forced herself to keep fighting. Around her, the remaining Marines were running out of ammunition and options. Sarah's vision began to blur as shock set in from her multiple wounds. She could hear the corpsman calling for her to apply pressure to her abdomen, but her hands seemed to move independently of her will. The sounds of battle became distant and muffled, as if she were listening from underwater. The fifth bullet struck her left shoulder, adding to the growing collection of wounds that were slowly sapping her strength. Sarah slumped against the wall, her rifle sliding from her grasp. She tried to reach for her sidearm, but her arms felt like they were made of lead. The world was starting to fade around the edges. Through the haze of pain and blood loss, Sarah could see insurgents moving toward their position. The Marines' defensive perimeter was collapsing, as wounded fighters were unable to maintain their positions. She forced herself to grab her rifle one more time, knowing that every shot might mean the difference between life and death for her fellow Marines. The sixth and seventh bullets hit her almost simultaneously, one in the right leg and another in the left arm. Sarah's body gave out completely, and she collapsed onto the dusty ground. Blood was pooling beneath her as she struggled to remain conscious. The sounds of battle continued around her, but they seemed to be coming from very far away. As darkness closed in, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Whether it was rescue or reinforcement, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that she had done her duty, fighting until she could fight no more. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the face of the corpsman leaning over her, his lips moving as he spoke words she could no longer hear. When Sarah regained consciousness, the world had changed completely. The sounds of gunfire had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. Her body felt like it was on fire, every nerve ending screaming in agony from the multiple bullet wounds she had sustained during the firefight. She tried to move but found that even the slightest motion sent waves of pain coursing through her damaged body. The first thing she noticed was that she was no longer where she had fallen during the battle. Someone had dragged her into what appeared to be the ruins of a bombed-out building. Concrete rubble surrounded her makeshift hiding place, and shafts of sunlight filtered through holes in what remained of the roof above. Sarah's military training told her that moving a wounded person without proper medical equipment was dangerous, but she was grateful to whoever had gotten her out of the street. As her vision cleared, Sarah saw the corpsman, Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Rodriguez, sitting against a wall nearby. His face was pale, and she could see blood seeping through a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. Despite his own wounds, he had somehow managed to drag her to safety and had been watching over her while she was unconscious. Rodriguez noticed she was awake and crawled over to check her condition. His medical bag was mostly empty, the supplies exhausted during the long firefight. But he still had a few bandages and a small amount of morphine. He whispered that they needed to stay quiet because insurgents were still searching the area for survivors from the Marine unit. Sarah learned that the ambush had been devastating. Of the 12 Marines and one corpsman who had started the mission, only she and Rodriguez had survived. The others had either been killed during the initial attack or had died from their wounds during the prolonged firefight. The enemy had eventually overrun their position, but somehow they had missed the small alcove where Rodriguez had hidden Sarah's unconscious body. The pain from her wounds was constant and overwhelming. Sarah counted at least 7 separate bullet holes in her body, though some might have been exit wounds from the same bullets. Her left leg was completely numb, and she suspected that one of the rounds had damaged nerves or blood vessels. Her abdomen was swollen and tender, indicating possible internal bleeding that could prove fatal without immediate medical attention. Rodriguez did his best to treat her wounds with the limited supplies he had remaining. He used strips torn from his own uniform to create additional bandages and applied pressure to the wounds that were still bleeding actively. The morphine helped dull the pain somewhat, but Sarah could tell that her condition was deteriorating. Without proper medical care, she knew she had perhaps hours rather than days to live. Despite their desperate situation, Rodriguez refused to give up. He explained that he had been trying to establish radio contact with friendly forces, but had been unsuccessful so far. The radio in their Humvee had been destroyed in the initial explosion, and his handheld radio had been damaged by shrapnel during the firefight. Still, he continued to try different frequencies, hoping to reach someone who could coordinate a rescue operation. On the second day of hiding in the ruins, Sarah's condition worsened significantly. Fever set in as her body fought to combat infection from her multiple wounds. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes unaware of where she was or what had happened. During her lucid moments, she could see the worry in Rodriguez's eyes as he monitored her vital signs and tried to keep her stable. The corpsman had found a small cache of bottled water in the ruins, probably left behind by civilians who had fled the fighting. He used most of it to clean Sarah's wounds and keep her hydrated, rationing the remainder carefully since he didn't know how long they might have to remain hidden. Food was non-existent, but Sarah found that she had little appetite anyway due to her deteriorating physical condition. Insurgent patrols passed by their hiding place several times during the second day. Sarah and Rodriguez remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as armed fighters searched through the rubble looking for survivors or valuable equipment. On one occasion, an insurgent came within 10 feet of their hiding spot, but failed to notice them concealed behind a fallen concrete slab. By the evening of the second day, Sarah was barely conscious. Her pulse was weak and irregular, and Rodriguez could see that she was going into shock from blood loss and infection. He had used the last of his medical supplies and was doing everything he could to keep her alive. But without proper medical facilities and blood transfusions, he knew she was dying. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to risk exposure by attempting to signal for help. Using a small mirror he had found in the rubble, he tried to reflect sunlight toward what he hoped were friendly aircraft flying overhead. It was an enormous gamble because insurgents might see the signal as well, but Sarah was running out of time. During the night, Sarah experienced what she later described as an out-of-body experience. She felt herself floating above her wounded body, watching Rodriguez as he continued his vigil beside her. The pain seemed to fade away, replaced by a strange sense of peace and detachment. She could see her own pale face and the blood-soaked bandages that covered her wounds. In her delirium, Sarah began to see faces from her past. Her parents appeared to her, along with her younger brother who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. They seemed to be encouraging her to let go, to stop fighting and accept the peace that death would bring. For a moment, she was tempted to give in to the overwhelming fatigue that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness permanently. But something deep inside, Sarah refused to surrender. Perhaps it was her military training, or simply her stubborn personality. But she found the strength to pull herself back from the edge of death. She focused on Rodriguez's voice as he whispered encouragement and updates on his efforts to establish radio contact. His dedication to saving her life gave her the motivation to keep fighting. As dawn broke on what would be their final day in the ruins, Rodriguez noticed increased aircraft activity in the area. Military helicopters were flying search patterns over the city, and he could hear the distant sound of vehicles moving through the streets. He dared to hope that a rescue operation was underway. But he also knew that time was running out for Sarah. Sarah's breathing had become shallow and labored. Her skin was gray and cold to the touch, classic signs of impending circulatory failure. Rodriguez knew that even if rescue arrived within the next few hours, it might be too late to save her life. Still, he continued to monitor her condition and provide what comfort he could while listening for any sign that help was approaching their location. The 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th bullets had taken their toll over the past 2 days. What had started as survivable wounds had become life-threatening injuries complicated by infection and blood loss. Sarah's body was shutting down system by system, but somehow her heart continued to beat, and her lungs continued to draw breath, sustained perhaps by sheer force of will and Rodriguez's dedicated care. As the morning progressed, Rodriguez heard something that made his heart race with hope and terror. The sound of boots on rubble was approaching their hiding place, but he couldn't tell whether they belonged to friend or enemy. He gripped his sidearm and prepared to defend Sarah's life with his own, knowing that this might be their last chance for rescue or their final moment alive. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by low voices speaking in English with distinctly American accents. Rodriguez felt a surge of relief wash over him as he recognized the tactical communications and movement patterns of U.S. Special Operations Forces. After 2 days of hiding in the ruins while Sarah fought for her life, rescue had finally arrived. The first SEAL to enter their hiding place was Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson, a veteran of multiple combat deployments who had been searching for survivors from the ambushed Marine convoy. His team had been methodically clearing buildings in the area, following up on intelligence reports that some Marines might have survived the devastating attack that had occurred 48 hours earlier. Thompson's expression grew grim as he assessed the scene before him. Rodriguez was conscious but clearly exhausted from his 2-day vigil, and Sarah appeared to be barely clinging to life. The SEAL immediately called for his team's medic, while beginning his own preliminary assessment of both survivors. What he saw convinced him that time was critically short, especially for the female Marine who had obviously sustained multiple gunshot wounds. Navy Hospital Corpsman First Class David Chen rushed into the hiding place with his medical kit and immediately began working on Sarah. As a special operations medic, Chen had extensive training in trauma medicine and had treated countless wounded warriors in combat situations. Even with his experience, he was shocked by the extent of Sarah's injuries and amazed that she was still alive after 2 days without proper medical care. Chen's initial assessment revealed that Sarah had been hit by 11 bullets during the firefight, a number that should have been fatal within hours of the initial trauma. 7 of the wounds had passed completely through her body, while 4 bullets remained lodged in her tissues. She had lost an enormous amount of blood, was running a high fever from infection, and was showing signs of multiple organ failure. The SEAL medic immediately started 2 intravenous lines and began pushing fluids and antibiotics into Sarah's system. He administered powerful pain medication and began the delicate process of stabilizing her condition enough for transport to a medical facility. Chen knew that moving someone in Sarah's condition was extremely risky, but leaving her in the field would certainly result in her death. While Chen worked on Sarah, other members of the SEAL team secured the area and established communications with their headquarters. They reported finding 2 survivors from the Marine convoy and requested immediate medical evacuation. The team leader, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Walsh, coordinated with air support to bring in a helicopter equipped with advanced life support equipment. Rodriguez, despite his own wounds and exhaustion, provided Chen with detailed information about Sarah's injuries and the treatment he had been able to provide over the past 2 days. The SEAL medic was impressed by the Marine Corpsman's dedication and skill in keeping Sarah alive under impossible conditions. Rodriguez had undoubtedly saved her life through his tireless care and protection. The helicopter arrived within 30 minutes of the SEAL team's call for medical evacuation. The aircraft was a specially equipped MH-60 Black Hawk with a full surgical team on board, including a trauma surgeon who began working on Sarah even before they were airborne. Every piece of equipment needed for emergency surgery was available in the cramped but efficient medical bay. During the flight to the combat support hospital, Sarah's condition deteriorated further. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and she went into cardiac arrest twice, requiring the surgical team to perform emergency resuscitation procedures. The trauma surgeon, Major Patricia Williams, later said that she had never seen anyone survive such extensive injuries for such an extended period without proper medical care. The helicopter landed at the hospital's emergency pad, where a full trauma team was waiting to receive both patients. Sarah was rushed directly into an operating room where surgeons worked for 12 hours to repair the damage caused by 11 bullets and 2 days of untreated trauma. They removed 4 bullets that had remained in her body, repaired damaged organs, and addressed the severe infections that had developed in several of her wounds. Rodriguez was treated for his own injuries in a separate operating room. His wounds were less severe than Sarah's, but he required surgery to repair damage to his left arm and treatment for dehydration and exhaustion. Throughout his own treatment, he repeatedly asked about Sarah's condition and whether she was going to survive her ordeal. The surgical team faced numerous challenges in treating Sarah's injuries. The bullets had caused damage to her liver, 1 kidney, her small intestine, and several major blood vessels. Infection had spread throughout her abdominal cavity, requiring extensive cleaning and antibiotic treatment. Several of her ribs had been fractured by bullet impacts, and one had punctured her left lung. Despite the severity of her injuries, Sarah's vital signs gradually stabilized during the lengthy surgery. Her young age, excellent physical condition before the attack, and perhaps most importantly, her fierce determination to survive all contributed to her body's ability to respond to treatment. The surgical team was cautiously optimistic that she might survive, though they warned that recovery would be a long and difficult process. News of Sarah's survival spread quickly through the military community in Iraq. Her story became a symbol of courage and determination, inspiring other service members who were facing their own dangerous missions in the ongoing conflict. The fact that she had survived 11 gunshot wounds and 2 days without proper medical care seemed almost miraculous to many who heard the details of her ordeal. Sarah remained unconscious for several days following her surgery, as her body began the slow process of healing. When she finally awakened, her first question was about Rodriguez and whether he had survived. Learning that the corpsman who had saved her life was recovering in a nearby ward brought tears to her eyes and gave her additional motivation to focus on her own recovery. The road to recovery was indeed long and difficult. Sarah underwent multiple additional surgeries to address complications from her injuries and to repair damage that couldn't be fully addressed during the initial emergency procedures. She spent months learning to walk again and regaining the use of her right arm, which had been severely damaged by one of the bullets. Physical therapy was painful and frustrating, but Sarah approached it with the same determination that had kept her alive during those terrible hours in Fallujah. She was supported throughout her recovery by Rodriguez, who had been transferred to the same medical facility and was undergoing his own rehabilitation. The bond forged between them during their survival ordeal remained strong throughout their recovery. Psychological recovery proved to be as challenging as physical healing. Sarah experienced nightmares and flashbacks related to the ambush and the deaths of her fellow Marines. She worked with military psychologists to process the trauma and guilt that many survivors experience after such devastating events. The knowledge that she had lived while 10 of her comrades had died was a burden that took time to reconcile. Eventually, both Sarah and Rodriguez were evacuated to military hospitals in the United States for continued treatment and rehabilitation. Their story of survival had gained national attention, and they were recognized for their courage and dedication to duty under the most extreme circumstances. Sarah received the Purple Heart for her wounds and several other decorations for her actions during the firefight. Years later, Sarah would reflect on those 48 hours in Fallujah as the defining moment of her life. The experience taught her that the human spirit is capable of enduring far more than most people ever realize, and that sometimes survival depends not just on individual strength, but on the dedication of others who refuse to give up hope. Her story continues to inspire military personnel and civilians alike, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope and determination can triumph over seemingly impossible odds.